Yay.
So is everyone still here? Ms. Richmond?
Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint that has some questions that were generated from my students, because with so many, I thought it would be easier than
Yeah, I don't see you on here. Speak of you. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, my whole computer just froze. So now I've lost my PowerPoint momentarily, but I'm sure actually, I have a, okay, well, you know what? Let me just ask you a basic question to pull it up. Or does someone want to start off with a question? I guess one of the first questions was, tell us a little bit about your first experiences with inclusion. I mean, you're a teacher who taught for many, many years under another kind of model, and then suddenly the school you taught at became a school that was including students with disabilities in your classroom. And how did that feel at the beginning? And how did you adjust your teaching?
In the beginning, I was very frightened, to be quite frank. My first student was a Down student. We have 2 Downs classes at our school. One is primary and the other is intermediate grades. And I was teaching 2nd grade, so I was going to get a student from the primary. And I really felt very ill-equipped to handle such a situation. Now, it wasn't full inclusion in the way that Benny was. Benny was my student in my class on my roster the whole day. So this was sort of getting the feet wet. So the child came in for 45 minutes, an hour at a time. It depended on the day. She had specials with the class. I always had a meeting a few times a week that we call, whoops, are you there?
I'm still here. I'm just trying to get up the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. That we called compliments in web. And so every student would give a compliment to one other student. They would think of something that they had noticed about something that they wanted to compliment them about. And I encouraged them to change who they complimented each time, whatever. But the very first time, it was always quite difficult. They didn't know what to say, and many of them passed. The first child to say anything was this child who had Down syndrome, and she made a very appropriate compliment. It was a little bit more superficial than my goal for the year was. I wanted something that was a little from the heart, not how you looked. But that was okay for a first time. Any 2nd grader might have made that kind of comment. And she really got everybody going. After that, they all felt much more confident. And after that, I suddenly said, oh, piece of cake. We can, I can do this. So sometimes you just need that one icebreaker. So that was my first time, and yes, I was frightened. But then as the years went on, I had many more kids from the core classes, and then I had other kinds of inclusion, learning disabilities, all different kinds. But Benny was the first child of his sort that I had, the first child who still had somewhat limited conversation, somewhat, was very reticent. So it was, you worry as a teacher, are you going to be able to do enough to meet this child's needs? And that was the anxiety that I felt. But just as in the other situation, as time went on and you get to know the child, all people are people. And you begin to see, you begin to have a sense of what each child in your class, whether they're inclusion or not, where they are and what they need, and you pick them up from that point. So you just kind of intuitively, at least I always felt for me, it was just somewhat intuitive in the first few weeks where I had a sense of what they needed. Does that answer? How do I not, should I do the next one, answer the next one, or does someone want to say something?
So if you want to talk, just unmute and talk. We're very informal here, and I know the technology is the imperfect, evolving science. So if two of you talk at once, that's not the end of the world either. You can also, type a question, although right now, when I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat bar.
Yeah, does anybody have anything they want to respond or add to the question? Add to my answer? Or question beyond?
Well, maybe we'll get a few more questions in and then.
Okay.
Go ahead. So another question that came up, several different varieties in the questions that they submit. Again, since I have so many students, I had them all submit 2 questions. Not every single question is going to be up here, but I tried to pick ones that represented certain areas that several people asked about. So how do you model inclusion for other students? How can you promote acceptance and embracing of the uniqueness of a student amongst his or her peers?
Well, that is really something that presumably you would do with all children, whether they were included or not. All children, part of the reason that I spent the time doing compliments, even in a world where time is at such a premium, was because it gave me a vehicle to just talk to kids on a personal level and to address feelings. It was always after recess, so issues would come up, recess issues would come up, and we would talk about them as well. But I would always stress the beauty of differences, how we all are the same in that we're all people, what things are the same. We all have eyes and ears, we breathe, we eat, we in most cases, we walk or have some ways to move, have some ways to communicate. And then we would talk about the myriad ways that we're all different and how it is that those differences are so enriching to all of us and how everybody has something special to offer and that there are people who are incredible artists. I am all thumbs and always have been. So I always would talk about how, for me, when I see somebody able to draw a picture, I'm in awe. And I just think it's such an extraordinary gift. Other kids are very musical. Other kids are very good in sports. And that was where I kind of focused a lot on multiple intelligences, not giving them that language, of course. But, in my head, I was stressing all the different ways that we're special. And I also used that time to talk about ways that kindness, that to me, they knew that there were certain things that were issues that could cause me to drop everything else in the classroom. And kindness was number 1. The environment was probably number 2. And they knew that those were issues that were important to me and that I wanted to model for them. We also talked about how you're not always in a great mood. Teachers sometimes are cranky, crabby, a bad day, you're tired, whatever it is. And so if I felt that I wasn't as patient as maybe I should have been, the next day I would go in and I would share with them how I felt when I went home, how I felt so badly and that this had happened and that I hope they were okay and did they have anything they wanted to tell me about that. So I was really modeling for them kindness, compassion, and understanding. I also had, in part of my behavior chart, was we used coins to use it in a way to teach money as well. And so they would get a certain amount of coins for different kinds of things, completing their work. Sometimes I would just impulsively say, everybody's being so quiet, I'm giving everybody a penny of this. They were, if the class was being very noisy in the hall, I would find the 2 kids who weren't and give them a larger amount of money to kind of make my point across. Well, what I would also get my point across. What I would also do was allow them to make recommendations that somebody should be rewarded. Like, I was feeling lonely on the playground and so came over to me and asked me if I wanted to play, and it made me feel so good. Can we give them some pennies, you know, or whatever? So it became kind of the way of the world, you know, so-and-so remembered to recycle and they forgot last week, Mrs. Richmond. I'm sure you're going to be so proud of them. Can we give them some coins? You know, whatever it was, that I was using the behavior chart as a way to reinforce the behaviors that I felt were critical behaviors for them to learn to become good people. We also talked about the fact that you could be a great student, and if you don't know how to get along with other people, you're not going to be able to succeed, because life and work and everything involves working with other people. So we would talk about, you know, that was my career instruction on the curriculum. Excuse me. All right, I'm not going to end. Okay. So it was modeled really just in the course of day-to-day classroom life.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to put up is kind of the different side of the coin in a minute, and that's about differentiating instruction. And again, they've been told a lot as teaching fellows, different ways to differentiate. First, to ask easier questions, what and who questions to build confidence and success, and then move on to harder questions. But again, that's, you know, kind of just kind of one sort of beginning, a little bit limited view of differentiation. And we're actually just about to start talking about differentiation in our class tomorrow. But what other strategies? I know one of the things you do so well is, you know, come up with these projects and activities that just naturally tap on different learning styles. In fact, you do it so well that I don't know if you hear him in the background, but Aaron, my younger child who had Miss Richmond a few years later, he wants to hear this, so he's sitting in the background and he's busting to say hello, but I thought we'll answer a few questions first. But, you know, this is the kind of teacher Miss Richmond is, that, you know, I'm talking to my class and Miss Richmond, that he's sitting here because he wants to hear what you have to say, even though it's not probably as exciting as the second grade class he was in, although maybe it is. So anyway, what strategies are available to you? Oh, he remembers the pennies.
Yeah, I remember the pennies.
So what other strategies do you have to help you differentiate?
Well, one of the best vehicles for differentiation is planning lessons that are somewhat open-ended, so that there's room for everybody. If you're doing writing, there isn't a level. You are working, everybody is writing about whatever, you know, you do a mini lesson first and introduce the topic, and everybody is writing on their level, and then you have individual conferences with students, so it's naturally differentiated. We were very lucky in my school that we had a lot of support. We had a lot of teaching assistants, and every class had 4 adults in the room during guided reading. Now, I know you're not necessarily going to be blessed to be in that kind of environment, especially in a teaching fellows school. It's likely that that won't be the case. But in guided reading, it was kind of easy. We went back and forth between heterogeneous groups and homogeneous groups. The point of a heterogeneous group was, even if the text was too difficult for some students, they could engage in the discussions. And so it might be a listening activity for them, unless they chose to try to read the reading portion, but the discussion portion was something that they could participate in, and they could be enriched by hearing other people's ideas. So reading and writing naturally did it. Also, a reading workshop period. If you don't have that amount of support, you can have either flexible groups that change over time, or you can have permanent groups during a reading workshop where everybody is engaged in reading something, and you're meeting with small groups. I'm saying small groups, not individuals, because although many of the books talk about meeting with individuals during a reading workshop, it's just not efficient. There's very little way in a real classroom that you're going to consistently get to meet with students often enough if you don't group them. So sometimes I would give kids, you know, a particular book that I wanted, you know, 5 kids to read. And we would just have informal meetings about that book. Other kids might be doing reading, but what we called buddy reading, where they would be reading with partners, and sometimes the partnerships would be heterogeneous, and sometimes I would give them leveled texts, and the partners would be homogeneous. It does take a lot of planning and some experience. Don't get discouraged. You may not be able to do all this the first year. After teaching for more than 30 years, I was at school till a minimum of 6 o'clock, at least 3 days a week. And
She was
often on
the
it.
last one to leave that building, and I know because I live down the block. It'd be dark, and all of
I
a
do
sudden,
too.
or we'd be in the playground. We'd go home, have dinner, come back to the playground, and there'd be one light on in the school, and it was Miss Richmond's lights. And then sometimes even a little later than 6:37.
Yeah, no, on a Friday, at least once a month, I would stay till 8 or 9 to get everything organized for a couple of weeks, and you know, whatever. I mean, that would be when I'd write up the homework for the following week and make sure that all the copies were made, and pull all the books from the reading closet so that I had all the group sets, and figure out which group was doing which and which skills. You know, that was my long-term planning. Now, I couldn't do that. I noticed that one of you is with a you know, with a child, has a child. When my kids were little, don't feel discouraged. I didn't do that when my kids were little. I had to bring the work home and do it that way. And I did plenty of planning, but not to the same degree that I did once my kids were older. So some of that is going to change. You're going to find that as your career, as you change and as you get either more experienced or your life changes, you're going to have to adapt. When I went back after my maternity leave, the first thing I did at back to school night was tell the parents my carpool schedule, so that they would know that they couldn't touch base with me on, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that they could send me a note. There was no computer in those days for emails. They could send me a note and I'd be happy to call them from home, or they could come in on another day when I did stay later. So I found that by being open with people and telling them the reality of my life, I kept any possible resentments at bay. They knew why I wasn't there, and they totally empathized. Parents of young kids also, because that's kind of off the subject for a minute. But in terms of differentiating, so buddy reading is one way, small group reading. I found flexible groupings to be the best way to differentiate. Depending on our project, sometimes I would just let kids pick out of a hat, and that would be the group. Sometimes it would be the tables they were sitting with. And, you know, I did usually plan my tables very carefully so that I knew, I kind of operated with a divide and conquer motif in my head, where I knew that I needed to be able to touch base with certain children in certain kinds of ways. And sometimes it was helpful to have some kids together and other kids not together. But because you would never want kids to feel labeled, I did it. It was never the same way. I would come up with a new way to group to enable me to interface that way. I also did a lot of things where, you know, if I was teaching a math game, the first time they played it, I never started everybody at once. The class was working on something else, some kind of either group thing or independent work, whatever it was, never busy work. But they're working on something that they didn't need me for. Maybe they had to illustrate a project they had already done, or something that I knew they could do cold with very little help, or just help each other. So that I could meet with every pair or every small group that was playing the game and make sure, even though I did it on the whiteboard, on the smart board, sorry, you know, in later years, or I did it on the carpet in front of everybody in earlier years, there's no guarantee, because each child answered one question doesn't mean they can actually sit down and play the game. Everybody did have a try playing it for a turn or two, but that's not the same as playing it without you there. So I would make sure to get everybody doing something, and I would start with one group, and once they were done, then I would hit the next group. And sometimes, and as I said, I was lucky, I always had a teaching assistant. So I would give certain groups to the TA, groups that I knew could do it more independently. She would kind of check to make sure they knew what they were doing. And then once one group was playing, I'd pull the other group, and eventually everybody was playing, and the first kids maybe went back and did whatever work they were working on. So that was another way to do it.
So instead of, I think a lot of times new teachers, and even, there are even principals in schools, especially in the city, that require teachers to produce a low, medium, and high level of work for every lesson they give. And I think that's kind of like a very limited view of differentiation. And I think, what Marcia's telling us about now, it's more about creating activities that everyone can participate in, and then building in the right kind of support. So, if you know that a few children are going to need you to explain it to them one-on-one, you build in this time where they're doing something independently so you can give them that support, and then they can do the same activity that everyone else is doing, or maybe, a slightly reduced load depending on need, but not necessarily, an easy sheet, a middle sheet, and a hard sheet, which is, I think, what a lot of people hear about in terms of differentiation. But I hope, certainly over this week and into next week, when we start talking about differentiation, you see more examples of, activities that everyone can do and that children can kind of find their own level, or that you can find a way to build in the right support.
One of the problems with the high, middle, and low sheets is that children who have been defined in quotes as low aren't being exposed then to certain things, and at what point, how are you going to elevate them?
Right.
Because unfortunately, in the world we live in, you don't have the luxury of time to say, okay, next week they'll do the middle sheet or the high sheet. So is there room to have some enrichment sheets, challenging sheets that are beyond the scope of the curriculum? Absolutely. And you want to stimulate as many kids as possible in as many ways. But I really, does someone want to say something?
It's Elon. It's Benny, but just finish your sentence, and then I'm going to let both of them say hello. And then
My name.
Okay, wait. Let her finish her sentence, and then you'll both say hello, and then you'll go upstairs and get ready for bed. Okay, finish your sentence, and then you're going to have a little hello moment.
Good. Okay, so anyway, I always feel that it's somewhat limiting, and I would rather have kids do, like, even if you had an easier sheet, I would rather them work in partnership with someone who maybe had a harder sheet, so that everybody has to have something that they are responsible for writing, because otherwise real learning doesn't take place. If they're not responsible, but one of the problems with cooperative learning is that it's very easy for more dependent children to learn, to think they're learning by watching someone else. And the reality is that we don't learn until we actually do it, which is a problem with much classroom instruction, is that so much of it is just a teacher talking, not a student working. And it's only some children who can learn that way.
Okay. We're going to let these boys just say a quick hello to one of their absolute favorite teachers.
Hey, Aaron, how are you, honey?
Good.
What are you doing for the summer?
Me and Elon are both doing this program called the ACE program, where we do 3 classes, and we're both taking the.
Hey, Lon, I see you out of the corner, just a little tiny bit of your head.
Wait, how do you see him? We don't see
Now
him.
I see him.
Wait, we don't see you.
Right, because you see my screen. I'm showing the PowerPoint. Okay, quick, and then you got to get to bed.
Why are you showing the PowerPoint?
Because I have questions on it, okay? Do you want to tell her what you're thinking and what you're doing?
Well, me and Aaron are taking Pitch Perfect, and I'm also taking volleyball and Raptor Racers.
And me and Elon are both taking Pitch Perfect, and I'm also taking basketball and 3D Studio.
Fantastic. Who's the teacher of Pitch Perfect? I'm assuming that's music, right?
Mrs. De La Vega.
Yeah, Miss De La Vega.
Oh, okay. So is that a new teacher for both of you?
Yeah, do you know Miss De La Vega?
Well,
No.
I met her for 1 year. I just met her. And
And for volleyball, I have Mrs. Farmer. Do you know Mrs. Farmer?
I do. I think I met her once or twice. What school does she teach in usually?
Southside Middle School. And
Middle
for rack erasers, I have this guy named Mr. Saglambini.
No, I don't know him.
Wait, did you know Miss Del Vega?
No.
Okay, guys, thank you for saying hello.
I'm gonna tell you.
I have a whole class
For
here. Aaron.
for basketball, I have Mr. DiGiacomo,
Okay.
and for TC, I have Mr. Lee.
Okay.
Guys, I will see you at your concert, okay? So we can chat then.
Yes, she is. Okay, go upstairs and get ready for bed. Okay.
Have a good night.
Okay. So can you imagine, class, after that heated IEP meeting where, and not just the IEP meeting, but that I was, in tears, and Marcia was in tears for me, and we were crying and thinking about each other till midnight for many nights. And, years later, we're now good friends. So, it's all about communication and about, and also, what she did for my kids is really unbelievable. I mean, Benny he would not have, I don't think there's any other teacher, even though the whole school is filled with fabulous teachers, who would have pushed him to the academic place that she did. And if
What about me?
no one did that, and if I wasn't going to do that for him, I don't think we would have gotten where we are. Aaron is a different story. Aaron came in very academic. She worked with Aaron a lot on listening, actually, that's a good story for the class also. Aaron academically was quite, quite strong, but he is, shall we say, distractible, kind of classic ADHD. I don't know, how would you?
Definitely. He was, well, first of all, he was such a deep thinker that sometimes he was off in his own, thinking about his own things, and sometimes he was just plain distracted. Some of it was being a kid, and some of it was having real attentional issues.
Is that good?
And she really was determined to get him to focus. And again, I wasn't the easiest parent, was I? Because I wasn't, I remember first you came up with the card on his desk, and he didn't like the card on the desk, and I didn't like that he didn't like the card. So what did I do? I went straight to the school psychologist. I'm not the easiest parent, but what we came up with in that meeting was wonderful.
That was great.
You want to tell them
We're talking about right now, the class,
what you came up with for Aaron? Which was
We came up with the idea, and I don't see that as a difficult parent, because you parents sometimes hear things from kids that they're uncomfortable saying to a teacher, especially early in the year. And as a mother myself, I understand that it's not easy hearing things about your kids. That to you they're absolutely perfect. So I really do understand. So don't feel that you were difficult. That was not the issue. And I was glad that you told me that he was uncomfortable with it, because something that works for one kid may not work for another. Anyway, what we did was we had him become, because he loved to write, he became my note taker. And so he would take notes during lessons, only really in the beginning of the year. He got tired of it after, a week or two, and it was always his choice. But then I kind of had a certain amount of leverage where I could say to him, do you want to take notes? I noticed that taking notes seems to help you pay attention more in a better way. If you don't want to take notes, is there something else we can do to guarantee that you're going to be paying attention? And so just that little exchange put him on notice in a positive way that he was expected to pay attention, and that he had a choice. He could be the note taker, and I'd make a big fuss about the wonderful notes. He was actually extraordinary
His
at
handwriting.
taking the notes. What?
Unbelievable. The other interesting thing, and we're going to be talking about learning styles next week, is that Aaron is a very, he likes to learn by reading. He was reading before kindergarten. He was writing sentences very early. He likes the written word. He likes taking in his information that way. And Marcia talks a lot in her class and likes students to develop their listening sense. And that was a challenge for him. Sometimes she would even talk about things and he'd go home and look it up on the computer to learn what she was talking about because he knew he had missed it. So he was very savvy for a 7-year-old, but yet, it's important to, like, you have to kind of take into, you have to understand your own style as a teacher and the style of your students, and not always give in to their preferred style, but certainly by having him take notes, she was using his preferred style to strengthen his auditory skills that needed strengthening, which was brilliant.
And what differentiation really is remediating, is using the strengths to remediate the weaknesses. I mean, that's really the bottom line. And that was the language 35 years ago when I started teaching, before differentiation was a word. Those were the words we used. And then later it got called differentiation. But the bottom line is figure out who the kid is and use who they are to maximize their potential. And that's really what it's all about.
So I thought this was a really interesting question because I think Covert, one of the wonderful things that it does is, you implement inclusion in such a beautiful way, but whenever I've sat down to interview and question, a lot of now I know all the research because I've been teaching this class for 3 years, and it's as if you read all these articles that I've read, but most of you haven't. So I think, and I think since the whole idea of disability studies, especially as a lens through which to see inclusion, is really very interdisciplinary and very, not quite in the same spirit as special education or even psychology. So I thought this was a very interesting question. To what extent was creating an environment fostering inclusion influenced by research and theory? And to what extent did you go with your gut once the students were in the room? And did you ever act against any research you had read because an alternate path seemed better? And also remember that for teachers who'd already been teaching for 20 years, they weren't schooled with the same kind of research that you're getting, but yet they had to implement it. And some do a fabulous job, as Marcia has done. And, others you'll see when you go into other schools are struggling more. So, what do you think about this?
I think that's a really excellent question. And I would have to say that it was always on top of research in terms of teaching reading. Which is interesting because people see me as a math person, but I also was very interested in how people learn to read and where the breakdown is with kids who have serious disabilities. I hadn't really read any inclusion research. I would say that I learned a tremendous amount of my research really from Diane. I read her book. I read and just trial by fire to some extent. Did I ever act against any research because an alternate path seemed better? I can't say that I knowingly did, but I would have had there been such a situation.
That's a great answer, and I think it's especially reassuring to these teachers who are really studying to be either ESL teachers actually or bilingual teachers. They're not necessarily, this group is not studying special ed. So I think it's a little bit scary to think that they're going to be in the position of including kids with disabilities, but it's nice for them to hear that you can really do a fabulous job without having been, schooled in that research.
It's very interesting. I have a good friend who teaches in a middle school.
Sorry, Mom. I'm going upstairs now to get ready for that.
Thanks.
He teaches in a partnership teaching where it's 2 teachers in the room. Interestingly enough, she was the special ed teacher and the other teacher was the regular ed teacher, and they've been together for many years, and they've really switched roles. she really discovered that has become an English teacher because that's what they have her doing. That's the subject that she was given as a former special ed teacher. And she discovered she loves teaching English. She loves reading the books and discussing it. And so they both do both things, but she's really not necessarily using what she had originally been trained to do. Now, again, she's an older teacher who had learned a long time ago when things were different. So when they started doing inclusion, she had to get some training and figure it out. So it's kind of interesting how you grow and develop. When I think about some of the things that changed, I mean, just in terms of the understanding we have now of the brain, that nobody understood. I mean, there were things that were blatantly wrong that we taught kids to do in terms of teaching reading. I mean, there was a period of time where phonics was like an absolute no-no. Now, do I teach phonics out of context? As little as possible, because that's not interesting. However, it turns out that now that they understand brains, it turns out that we all isolate sounds in our brain, that we think we're reading whole words, but that our brain is really dealing with the phonemes. So my teaching changed tremendously. Had that research not worked in the classroom, I might have I always was one who I was never rigid with anything. So I would definitely change my mind if something wasn't working, but I was always informed. I always also changed my teaching when I got new information. And one of the things that I was very judgmental about was teachers who did not keep reading and keep learning and use what they learned. I mean, it was just, when I was a new teacher, there were so many teachers who were bitter and angry and and I always used to come home and say, if I start sounding like a teacher who really doesn't like the kids, doesn't like what they're doing and hasn't changed from 20 years ago, please tell me I have to retire. And that is not why I retired. I retired just because I really miss it tremendously, but they were giving an incentive that I couldn't afford not to take.
And your granddaughter, don't forget your
what? And yes, and I had a new granddaughter, and now I have two grandchildren that I did want to be able to spend more time with. But the bottom line is, as much as I love the spending time with them, I probably would not have retired at that particular moment in time without the push of the incentive.
So I thought this was an interesting question. I have so many interesting questions, and I promised Marcia and my class 40 minutes. We're already over it, but let's try and wrap it up by 9:30, even though there's so much to say. But this is an interesting question. Do you have any advice about approaching an IEP meeting? Have there been times when you have felt the students' needs were not properly considered by the school or the parents, and how did you go about addressing that?
Absolutely. To the extent I was once at an IEP meeting, or a meeting where we were discussing getting two twins classified. They were both in my class. And one of them cooperated during the testing. And as a result, her IQ came out higher. And there was a bigger gap between her functioning, which was in those days how you made these decisions. She got classified. She was actually the less needy. The other one was so needy that she was ripping up the IQ test papers. She was incredibly uncooperative. The psychologist came into the meeting telling me, I'm going to say that and we're going to fight for her, and left me hanging in the wind. And I actually got so upset, so angry, that I ended up, the mother had called a doctor who had the kids tested, seen by a neurologist. The neurologist never sent in the report. I was trying to get her classified as other health impaired. And I called the doctor and basically blasted her because she hadn't sent the report in on time. And I really got very upset with the chair of the CSE, to the extent that she ended up calling my principal and said, you need to tell her she can't do that. And he said to her, you don't allow principals there at these meetings very often because you know that we would advocate for the children in our charge. How do you expect a teacher not to advocate for the kid? That's her job. She should be. And so he defended me, but they were not very happy with me at all. And I finally got them to promise to retest her the following fall. It was already spring. And she ended up being classified immediately then because they could use a different benchmark. Let's see, what else? There was a time many, many years ago, the first time I met the person who later became the superintendent of schools, where they did not accept a student into, in those days, there was no inclusion, there was some homogeneous grouping, not a lot, but there was a gifted program. And the student who they didn't accept became the valedictorian of his graduating class, and I called furious because he missed it by 1 point, and they weren't listening to teachers because there had been a whole thing another year, and I blasted the superintendent, who ended up putting him in the next year and apologizing to me that spring. He, with one of these, I can't tell you why, but you were right, kinds of moments. So I feel that it's very important to speak, but not until you have tenure. You do have to be realistic, but you do have to speak up for kids.
So I've been kind of going through the questions, and a lot of them you've already answered. And I think the first one on this slide you answered, advice about differentiation for a new teacher. And you alluded to the second one, but I want to ask you that. And I also want to mention that, the kinds of disabilities that you in New York City are going to be asked to include are still relatively minor compared to the depths of the impairments that, Marcia faces, even my own son. Even today, even though he's an honor student here in middle school, I doubt that if we move back to the city tomorrow and he was interviewed by a principal or a psychologist in the New York City schools, I doubt that he would be placed in a general ed class. And I'm not even sure he could function with the supports that he would be given there, even though with, relatively few supports, he's functioning here. So, bear that in mind. So what you're looking at is still not nearly what some of these suburban towns are looking at. But how radical are the adjustments you make for special ed students? Is it a totally different way of presenting material or a more minor change?
It really depends. One of the things I make sure to do is to have as many manipulatives as possible. So if it's social studies, I absolutely have the map down. Even if we're talking about Thanksgiving, we'll talk about, where is Massachusetts? Where is this? And some of that, with little ones, most of the kids don't necessarily have that in their mind. But as kids get older, some kids can visualize those kinds of things and they don't need to have it reviewed. But if you have it up there, then any student who isn't good at geography or isn't good at something like that, it takes you 2 seconds to review it and to kind of maybe have that student be the one to answer the question or come and point to try to get a visual, to try to get a sense of how big an ocean is relative to land. If it's math, I have those kinds of manipulatives. So one of the things I would always do is have manipulatives. I always figure that they're going to be retaught. So they're taught with the lesson, and then I try to find time for me to reteach. I didn't like to use the teaching assistant to reteach, particularly in math. Then they have their resource, the special education teacher period. So I would say to her, anything that they weren't getting, we would talk every day. And I would just say, please focus on this, please focus on that. In terms of like math or social studies, science pretty much, certainly in the primary grades, since so much of it was hands-on, they were able to handle it. In fact, sometimes that was where they would shine. In reading, of course, it was more radical. If reading was a difficulty for them, they would be reading on a different text and that a different level, because you have to ultimately learn how to read. So there would be times when they would be read to increase the level of their thinking, but they would be read. But when they were doing actual reading, learning to read, they would do it with, they would have their text on their level. And sometimes the special ed teacher would do it, sometimes I would do it, sometimes we would both do it. But the biggest intervention was time, making sure they were manipulatives, and reteaching, and cycling through, coming back to something. So if it was something that I knew they had trouble with early on, I would make sure that they would have a problem. In fact, everybody in the class I would have a math, and this is particularly in math, I would have a math warm-up in the morning, and everybody would do something with counting money, something fun with physically counting the money, something with family of facts, some adding, some subtracting. I would change it up each day, but they'd have 3, 4 things to do in the morning that was part of the warm-up, and that way they had to review things, on a daily basis.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. I think now's a good time to open it up to some questions. Marcia, I just noticed, because I wasn't seeing the screen before, I only see the top of your head and your eye.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was being lazy and leaning back because I saw your PowerPoint, so I figured that nobody was seeing me.
Oh, well, that's probably true. PowerPoint isn't there, so we want to see a beautiful smile. So does anyone, have a question that, didn't get asked, or a comment? And again, just unmute and talk or type a question.
I have a question, because I just noticed that my questions didn't come up on the comment box.
Okay.
You kind of answered earlier, but I was kind of curious, how would you tackle an inclusive setting or environment that is so diverse where it's hard to meet everyone's needs?
It's, the reality is it's frustrating. You have to kind of take a deep breath in September and know that you are never going to be able to meet every need in every way. It can't happen. There were years where I would say, oh my God, they didn't do enough writing. I mean, we wrote all the time, but we didn't do enough full writings. There were other years where I'd say, oh yeah, I didn't get through to the end of the social studies.
It reminds me of the last class you had before you retired. Wasn't that a class where in October you were kind of frustrated? Was that the one where there were so many different issues?
No, I don't think it was that class, but I did have.
Or the one before that. It was it was after you had my kids.
I don't think it was that year. But yes, when there are different kids, you just kind of have to different needs. You just kind of have to figure that you're going to prioritize, and you're going to try to give every child something. And if at the end, one of the things that was the most important, I think, to me about addressing needs was I would always reflect at the end of the day on what I got done and what I didn't get done, and who understood what and who didn't understand what. And so from there, I would often change. I wasn't a person who did weekly plans, because luckily I had a principal who didn't care, because I felt that they changed too often. So I did daily plans, and I would look at, okay, this kid did not have a clue about what we were doing there. This kid looked bored to tears when I was teaching this in this kind of way, and I would try to come up with something that could meet a few needs at once in any given subject, and and work from there. But the main thing was you have to learn not to beat yourself up. I did a lot of beating myself up in the early years because I felt that I wasn't doing enough for everybody, and most of the kids grew more, more than some other kids grew, and you only have two hands. I know one year my principal gave me a class where, and he meant it as a compliment, and it was, he gave me, I would say, 12 truly brilliant, unusually brilliant kids, and 10 really challenged behavioral and special needs kids, many of whom were bright but couldn't read. Actually, that was the year I had those twins. And so they needed stimulation, oral stimulation, discussions, things like that, where they could shine. And I had to meet their needs. And I had these 12 kids who, whatever I put in front of them, it was done yesterday. And I did it. I luckily, my kids were grown, and I had time to plan at the end of each day and to come up with new books and whatever for those kids and meet the needs. But I said to him at the end of the year, I said, I know you intended it as a compliment. He said, yes, and you did it. And I said, yeah, but you have to be aware that a teacher, no matter how strong they are, has two hands. That's all we have. In those days, we didn't even have TAs. You only have two hands, and you can only do what you can do. So you have to just keep in mind that you're doing your best as long as you're reflecting and thinking about trying new things and being creative and coming up with new ideas when one thing didn't work. So something didn't work. You tried it. Doesn't mean it won't work next year, for another student or another group of students. So as long as you keep on evaluating where you are and what you're doing, you're doing the best you can, and just kind of take a deep breath and do some relaxing exercises, because teaching is a stressful job if you care, which I think most people do.
Okay.
Let's take one more question, if there is one.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, you talked about evaluating.
Yeah, I'd love to have you in my class.
Only because my questions I had posted questions, but I guess it didn't go through for some reason. I don't know why.
No, well, the problem is I had 60 posted questions because I have two classes who are tuning in, so I couldn't put them all up because we only have an hour. So I had 20 up there, and I only got to 12. Okay, so it's not like I decided, just so you know. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I was just curious. You talked about evaluating, right? So how would you kind of assess, because, in teaching fellows, we talk about assessments and all that kind of stuff. So how would you assess that, your lesson was effective in whatever strategy that you implemented on that particular day? Like, what was some strategies that you used to kind of evaluate specifically? I'm just kind of curious.
I tended, every lesson had something that the children had to do at the end of it. So that was a way, and I was never a teacher who was ever at my desk. I always had paperwork to do at the end of the day because I never did it during the day. And so I would be circulating, and I would see what they were doing. I would notice the kids who were leaning over. Sometimes one of the biggest problems that you have with some kids is the kids who try to hide that they don't understand. There are kids who really know that they don't get it, but there's so much of their ego at stake that they just can't. They're not kids who can easily come over and say, I really don't understand, please help me. And so they're the ones who will look over at someone else's paper and ask a friend to help. But, depending on your class, sometimes kids can explain very well. Sometimes kids can explain better than the teacher can. Sometimes that was a tool that I would often use, was say to someone who I knew got it, and I'd say, my way of explaining it isn't helping so-and-so really get this. Do you think you want to give it a try? And sometimes that would help, but sometimes it wouldn't. So as I walked around, I was very careful to look for all of the subtle cues as to what the kids were doing, how they were tackling the work. Some kids avoided it. They just didn't do it. That told me something. It could have been an issue with behavior, but more likely than not, one of the most powerful conferences I ever went to, the speaker said, what's in it for a kid to not behave? Why? Why would they not behave? And so whenever I felt myself kind of losing it at a kid, a kid was being oppositional or whatever they were doing, I would just take a deep breath and say, why is he doing this? What's in it for him? Not that I never lost it, I did. But, I tried very hard to keep that in mind. And so as I walked around, and as you get experience, you're going to know what to look for. You're going to see the kids who get it, the kids who don't. Sometimes they just need 2 sentences from you, and then they get it. And sometimes that the whole lesson bombed, that nobody really has a clue what they're doing, and so you'd reteach it the next day. One time we did there's a science experiment in we do a measurement unit, and as part of measuring temperature, there was an experiment where they would have water with ice, water that was warm, and room temperature water. They would take the temperature before lunch and then after lunch of the things. But before lunch, they would have to make a prediction, what will happen. One year, 2/3 or 3/4 of the class predicted that the warm water would get warmer and the cold water would get colder. We had a discussion afterwards. What happens to your mom and dad's coffee? What happens to your ice cream? What happens to an ice cube if you put it out? They all knew. Is it warmer when it melts or is it colder? They knew the answers. So I said, okay, we're doing the same experiment the next day. We did it again. Very few kids changed their predictions. It took me a week of redoing the experiment to convince them. And what that told me was that they were developmentally not ready. They didn't have conservation yet. And without conservation, they really couldn't grasp that. So they needed a lot of exposure to it. As a stubborn person, I wanted them to get it. So I kept on doing it until they finally got it.
I think both that and also what you said before about behavior, why would a kid not want to behave? That generally, like, kids want to learn, they want to behave. And I think that philosophy, that was a big difference between what we encountered in the city with my son, where, his behavior was problematic. But even though he was only 5 years old, the teachers, the approach was, his behavior is terrible. He's not ready for school. He has to go off to a class in District 75 where they can maybe fix his behavior and then maybe he can come back. Whereas at Colbert, all of a sudden it became, well, why isn't he behaving? And what can we do in the classroom to make him comfortable? Or what happens right before he misbehaves? Is he too hot? Does he need a break? I mean, in kindergarten, he was getting a break every 10 minutes because he needed a break every 10 minutes in order to function for 10 minutes. And, I think, Marcia, the question isn't, why is the child being bad in my class, but what can I do? Or, not why aren't these children getting it, but what can I do? If I have to stay a week on the topic, I'll stay a week on the topic. How many different ways can I present it so that they will get it? And, once you need to build in also some flexibility. And that's why teaching in the city is difficult, because some of you are under very tight time constraints, although we all finish our curriculum on the island and in the city. It's hard when you have to be lockstep with a certain curriculum to do that. But that's the kind of teaching that, allows you to get to know your students and meet their needs. LaShawn typed a comment that I thought was a really nice last question. And she asks, for Marcia, what is your fondest memory of teaching? Which is probably not so easy to answer after a 30-year career, but I'm sure it has to do with one of my kids.
I can't even, there's absolutely no way to answer that question, because I remember most of the kids that I had. I mean, I guess I would have to say that my fondest memories were the successes, was knowing at the end of the year that I had made a difference. But, when I just saw Aaron and Benny, it makes my heart melt to know that I still have contact with these kids. I was once buying some jewelry at Fortunoff's, and somebody one of the salesperson recognized my name and said, "You had my daughter in first grade." That had been 30 years before, and she told me something I had said. It was either my first or second year of teaching. And I was absolutely, she said, and you were so on the money. And I was shocked. Like, how could someone who didn't even have kids yet, have the nerve to say something like that? It was like, I couldn't believe it. But all those things added up to just such joy and enrichment that I miss it every day. So that's not really answering your question because I can't. I mean, I guess I could say that I loved baking with them for birthdays. We used to bake. I used to bake. Each kid used to bake for birthdays. So I loved that.
So, I mean, that's a great way to end because I know, you know, what you've heard tonight is that there's a lot more hard work out there, which you already know, and you're working so hard this summer. I can't even, you know, understand how you get it all done, you know, and you will be working very hard as teachers too, but that's a very nice uplifting way to end that, you know, in 30 years, you're going to be on someone's video conference and you're not going to be able to know what memory to bring up because it really is a fabulous career with all its difficulties. So I didn't actually post any assignment other than watching this tonight. I have recorded it. Hopefully I'll be able to get it up, you know, within an hour or so. But certainly if you have more questions, you know, maybe I'll open up like an optional discussion board. And if there's anything that came up that really wasn't answered, I'm actually seeing Marcia Saturday and I'll sit her down and I'll make her answer all those questions. We're going to put
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to email a question, I'm happy to have Diane give me your email. Just on the subject, let me know that you're not a stranger, you know, so that I don't delete it by mistake. You know, so tell me that you're a Diane student or something like that. And I will be happy to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to say goodnight and
Good night.
get some rest, and all of you go to bed since you're probably going to be up at 5:30 in the morning to begin your day tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
very welcome and good luck.
Thank you.
It's,
Thank you.
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye. Bye.